And now, without further ado, I am very pleased to welcome our first speaker, Rob Magliaro. As the former head of education and workforce at Google and co-founder of a P-Tech high school in New York City, Rob explores how schools uniquely prepare students for uncertainty and why it matters now more than ever. Thank you, Rob.
Thank you, Megan, and thank you everyone for having me here. To start us off, I want to ask you a question. How many of you have landed in the place that you had expected and envisioned when you were in high school? Show a raise of hands. Oh, I see one person. Are you a doctor or a lawyer? Because usually that's the straighter line. Actually, Megan already framed this up. Data shows that most people are like those of us in the audience tonight. We change careers often. We have big transitions in our lives. We don't end up in the place that we had expected. And this trend is only accelerating. Yet despite that, most people tend to think that life looks a little bit like this. A pretty linear line. This is actually my story, as I tell it. I went to college, I became a teacher, founded a school, and somehow found myself at Google, which you'll find out about in a second. But that's actually not reality, as we've seen in the audience. When we hit the real world, our plan changes. The world is full of friction, a word I think you'll hear a lot of tonight. Because really, most lives look something like that. This is my real story, if I was to tell it, so if you'll bear with me. I went to college. I did not study education. I studied Chinese and international relations. I had a really specific plan. And then the Great Recession happened, which is dating me a bit. It nudged me into teaching, which thank God that it did. Hurricane Sandy hit New York City and presented an opportunity to open a really meaningful high school program. And during that time, I thought about making a transition, so I applied to business school, and COVID shut that plan down. Now, admissions introduced me to my wife, so I'll call that one a draw. But I somehow found my way to Google, and as Megan said, it didn't have anything to do with my skills. It had to do with a lot of other factors. And so this isn't just me. This is a pattern I've seen with students and the hundreds of thousands of people who my program at Google served to help them try to find a job. And it made me obsessed with this question, which is why we're all here tonight. Because our students are not their most vulnerable when they're with us in school. They're their most vulnerable when they leave us, when they graduate, when they get their first job, when they have to deal with that first big failure, when they have to make a decision with incomplete information and no clear right answer, which is actually just what adulthood is. It's that moment that all of us are thinking about tonight and that you think about constantly is, what decision is the young person in my life going to make when there isn't a teacher, a parent, or a mentor around? And so I'm going to share what I've learned from partnering with thousands of higher education institutions, hundreds of employers, being on the other side of that statistic that Megan shared about job changes and the future of AI. And I've actually learned three things, which have kind of been touched on already. The people who navigate this the best are not with the sharpest credentials or skills, but they're folks who can do hard things, who can create genuine community, and who have a strong sense of identity that is their navigating compass. And I believe that schools are the best shot at developing that. They have the time, the trust, the relationships, and the mission to do that. And so tonight I'm going to show you that, not through theory, but through practice and through stories of students who I've encountered over the course of my work in this space. So let's start off with do hard things. I'm going to take you to New York City, to the School for Emergency Management, which circumstantially is located on Pearl Street also, which is really weird. But I opened it in 2013 when the city looked something like this. Hurricane Sandy had just hit New York City and had devastated many neighborhoods. We opened our school to train students in the field of emergency management, and our idea was that we could then send them back to their communities to help them recover, which we did right away. But we also know that an important part of school, an important part of life, is creating community resilience. And so we asked them, what do you want to do to prepare for the next moment like this? And we had them look at data and also look at their own experience in their neighborhood. And they landed on the really specific question of ambulance response times. Very, very specific. And what they found, as you can see here, is that they're slow. Like not just a little slow, like public health crisis, hiding in plain sight, slow. For any of you who are in medicine, you know that if you're experiencing a cardiac event, for every minute that it takes for an ambulance to arrive, your chances of survival decrease by 10%, which is really scary. And so they decided they were gonna implement a solution that's quite simple. They were gonna make sure everybody knew how to do CPR, because that can triple survival rates if you're doing that while you're waiting for an ambulance to arrive. So, a bunch of high school students spanned out across New York City, across the 5 boroughs, and they created a Hands to Heart CPR team. They trained 1,000 people in the first year alone. That guy is my favorite. And they trained 1,000 people, and during the COVID pandemic, actually, 2 of our students performed CPR on family members and saved their lives. And so they learned a lot of great things. They learned about careers in emergency medicine, about data, all of that good stuff. But what they really learned was a posture towards hard things. We had given them a problem adults hadn't been able to solve and still doesn't have a complete solution. Because, and this is why I'm convinced it matters, when I was at Google talking to employers, they shared that skills like CPR or creating this really fancy map can be taught. But what they can't teach students is to stay with a difficult problem and to make good decisions while doing it. Because as we all know, and I had this conversation earlier tonight, in a world of infinite distraction and shrinking attention spans, the ability to stick with something hard all the way through is one of the scarcest capacities that we have. And it's something that a school can build, because learning is hard, learning is a struggle, and friction creates the deep type of transformational learning that's necessary to navigate the world that we're entering. It also builds community, which is the second advantage. So I'm going to share another insight, probably something that everyone here is familiar with, that I heard from employers, but credentials actually open fewer doors than we would hope. People do. And so I'm going to share a story about this, and it was actually my own transition from high school principal to Google, which I get lots of questions about. And I actually found my job on all places, LinkedIn. As most of you know, if you've ever searched for a job, going on LinkedIn is a place where you can feel really busy but not actually make a lot of progress. But I put my cynicism aside, and I looked at my network. And there, at Google, in a transitional program for young employees, was this guy, Edward. I don't expect you to know who Edward is, but he was very special to me because he was my first student who I taught in 8th grade math. And so I reached out to Edward. Edward gave me a referral. Edward got a signing bonus. I got a job. And then somewhere along the line, I went from Mr. Magliaro to Rob. In a world where AI is taking over the transactional parts of career and life, humans have never mattered more. Human relationships have never mattered more. Because the single biggest predictor of success is who you know across walks of life. And so that transformation from Mr. Magliaro to Rob didn't happen by accident. Our school community asked really hard questions about how we care for each other, how we look out for our peers, how we celebrate and mourn together, how we ask for help, and how we give it. And so real community is where the friction hits, and it's developing a shared identity that allows moments like this to happen where you can lean on one another, and they're completely unpredictable in when they'll arise again. Which brings me to my third and final capacity, which is around identity, which was just touched on. And so I've been thinking a lot about identity over the past 2 years because at Google, I helped create a tool called Career Dreamer. And it's an AI-driven tool where you can put in your interests, your skills, your education, and it will give you career paths based on a whole ton of data. We trained this thing on mountains of data, Bureau of Labor Statistics data, lightcast data, search data, blah, blah, blah. But the single most important output was actually not a job match. It wasn't more information. It wasn't a career pathway. It was something that we called a career identity statement, which is just a fancy word for being able to articulate your story and what you want to build. And that's something that actually AI can't optimize for. It has to be built slowly and figuring out what you like and where you want to bring your life. It's developed by what we used to call at my school the look. You would see a student in the hallway, they would be with a teacher or a counselor, and they would say, I see you, I trust you, you're more than you can even imagine, and you need to show the world. And only schools can do that. So I'm going to close with one last story, which I think is a good example of this, from one of my favorite students named Josue. He's there in the back by the bald person leaning down with he has the ponytail. We were catching up a few weeks ago. We were grabbing beers. Don't worry, he's 25 now. And he was part of our initial paramedicine program. He founded the CPR team I talked about before. But most importantly, he was part of our COVID graduating class, which anybody had a student or is part of that knows that that was a very different experience. So we were catching up and he was sharing stories. And what was interesting to me was the stories he chose to share and those that he didn't, and what that told me about his high school experience. And so the first story he shared was this. If you've experienced the COVID graduation, you knew during that time we weren't allowed to have big groups of people all together. And so my staff, facing a hard and difficult problem that we had to persist through, thought, how do we bring this indelible moment to our students? Because they've worked so hard and they need to be recognized for what they've become and who they want to become. And so we built a float and we brought graduation to them. We went to 60 houses across 5 boroughs over 2 days. There's some video online, it's pretty wild. But we just showed up. And what Josue said to me was that when we showed up, it felt like when the world was falling apart, his community saw him and recognized him. It showed him, too, that when things get really hard, he can activate that community because they know who he is. And whenever some things get really hard and he questions if people care, he thinks about that float coming around the corner of the block to his house. The second thing that happened that year was we were able to randomly secure, it wasn't really random, but secure a graduation on Good Morning America for our students. And the graduation speaker was none other than Matthew McConaughey, which, if you've seen Dazed and Confused, is a super weird pick. But all right. We also picked Josue to speak, which you can see right here. From his house, on Zoom, with his family in the background, in the middle of COVID, on national TV, he still can't believe we trusted him to do that. Especially, and I don't think he'd mind me sharing this, because on the last in-person trip we took as a senior class, he smuggled a hookah onto the bus. So he had some work to do. But he absolutely killed it, and he's still a celebrity at our high school. And this is him now. And yeah, so he's a paramedic in New York City. And we finally got to the part about what he's doing now, what he does at work. He makes decisions with people's lives in his hand every day. This is the kid who made a really poor decision in his senior year, who people are trusting him on their worst day. And I would trust him. Now, the interesting part that he didn't talk about was that in the whole conversation was not his EMT training, it wasn't his degree or the skills he had, but it was the float, it was the Good Morning America opportunity to show himself on TV. And the fact that we helped him through a moment of a poor decision to become who he is. And it's these moments where we say, we trust you, we see you, we know you're capable of more, and we want you to show that to the world, that helps develop identity and build our students to be persistent in the world that's ahead. It's the daily, unglamorous building of space that affirms who students are, what they like, and what their life can become. They're not soft skills. These are durable human capacities that travel, that no AI, no platform can do, only a school. So, in a world where every life looks like this, where friction is guaranteed, The question that we have tonight is, how do our schools prepare students to deal with a world when friction hits and the plan goes out the window? Josue knows who he is. He knows his community has his back and that he can do hard things because he's done them. The theme is that you're going to be pressured to move fast. But the human advantage can't be downloaded and it cannot be optimized. It has to be designed, co-created, slowly, intentionally, by people like you in schools like this. And that's what travels. Thank you.